Hello and welcome to Fatal Daily. Now, there's a bit of a twist today as I'm taking over James Woodburn, who is currently overseas. So I'm going to be interviewing Nick Hubble, our Friday editor. He's also the editor of the Jim Rickards Strategic Intelligence Australia. Nick, how are you going?
Yeah, good to see you, Brian.
Yeah, I think it's the first time I actually interview you. The last time I think in our interaction is you interviewing me. So we'll see how this one goes when you're on the other side. So Nick, you've got a pretty interesting article today, and I'm going to let you roll with it. So you wrote that mining will be the only industry left on the road to net zero. Now, that's a pretty big claim, but I want you to unpack for us what you mean by net zero for the benefit of our viewers who don't really know exactly what's going on. And tell us a bit more about how you came to this perspective.
Yeah, net zero is the commitment from governments around the world to either cut emissions-based activities or to offset them somehow, so to suck carbon back into the ground somehow, or plant trees or whatever it is. The idea is that we're going to have to be net zero by 2050 in order to prevent climate change from getting out of control and causing all sorts of damage. In some cases, these are legally binding commitments. The UK was the first one to commit to that. And the point I'm making is that the media is starting to realize that the implications of actually trying to reach net zero are pretty damn dire. There was a report cut from Bloomberg a few days ago which claimed that we'd have to go on a war-footing economy in order to achieve this. And I've got some other calculations and some other pieces of analysis from other parts of the media and experts and so on in the article this week. And they all pretty much conclude that we have to do some pretty damn extreme things in order to try and reach net zero. That's now the mainstream view. It was our view a few years ago. But this is sort of filtered out to the mainstream media now. It's making everyone realize that trying to achieve net zero is going to need some serious sacrifices. And my point is that there's not many parts of the economy or financial markets or stock markets, whatever it might be, that can withstand a war-footing economy, that can perform well in a war-footing economy, that will reward investors for holding those assets in a war-footing economy. If we're going to crush, our living standards, our businesses, our government budget in order to try to achieve net zero, which is what it would take, then most financial markets no longer make sense for investors. The exception that I can find is mining. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's because trying to achieve net zero needs an extraordinary amount of metals and minerals that mining companies are going to have to dig up, which means that's where you should be investing your money to the extent that you believe we're going to actually stick to this road to net zero over the next, 26 years.
So what types of resource demand are we talking about, and which particular materials and commodities are going to benefit the most in this particular agenda should it go ahead?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because there's lots of different combinations of ways that you can try and reach net zero. How much solar to use, how much wind, how much nuclear, and that all those change the equation quite a lot. It's not clear how many, for example, transmissions lines we would need to build and interconnectors between countries and continents even. So the estimates can vary a lot. So for example, anything that's heavy on the transmissions grid needs a lot of steel. Anything that's heavy on solar needs complex minerals. The big one that everyone agrees on is copper, because copper is just basically the metal of the energy transition. And the point that I think we should make here is that in order to try and reach net zero, the general consensus on these resource demands estimates is that we need to increase mining by about fivefold. I should say metals production by about fivefold, because we've got declining ore grades, remember. We've got declining efficiency in mines because the metal that's easy to mine has already been hoovered up. And so the amount of actual mining it would require to get the same amount of copper is going to increase as well. But you need to produce about 5 times as much metal in order to try and achieve net zero. And that's assuming we start today, by the way, which we're not doing. We're not increasing our mining rates fivefold. In fact, there's been underinvestment in new mining. And so my argument is that those companies that have secured resources and reserves in these energy transition metals are going to benefit disproportionately because the demand is going to come flying in from all these net zero projects, and the supply can't adjust fast enough. It takes about the same amount of time to find and develop mines as it will to take to get to net zero, right? So even if we did decide we're going to go on a war footing economy and focus on mining and the net zero economy, renewables and the grid, we'd still be well behind the 8 ball. In fact, so far that we're just not going to reach net zero by 2050 anyway. But the only promising sector of the market in this scenario would be the mining sector, because of the fact that demand's going to outstrip supply so heavily.
So you're suggesting that companies that have large and proven resources and reserves are going to benefit from this. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
And in that case, what opportunities would be presented to potential investors and the viewers out there going forward to capitalize on this opportunity?
Yeah, so this is our mutual colleague James Cooper's area of expertise. He was an exploration geologist. He focused on these resources and reserves and their potential and where they're proven and where they're not proven, and which companies are likely to be taken over by the big miners to actually bring those projects to production. He's got a report out about all of that. I'm sure we'll link to it in the description below if there isn't a link popping up in the video right now. So I encourage people to check that out, because what he's done is identify which particular companies, I think they're on the ASX, but I'm not sure, will be the focus of this boom in takeover bids, but also just generally because the value of their resources should go up if we pursue this net zero agenda, continue to pursue it to the extent that we have been, or even increase the rate that we've been doing it as the governments and all these activists claim we need to do. I think that's the best way to go about this. What I'm really arguing in this piece, though, is that everything else is going to be in quite a lot of trouble. If we try and crush our economy and our living standards, then I don't see where else you might want to invest.
If we go back to the net zero agenda and the acceptance from the general public, how has it changed, say, 4 years ago, when you had significant popular support towards parties that are seeking to push this against the parties that have been saying the talking points that we have been for the last few years saying it's illogical? What types of developments have you seen in different nations around the world on whether this is going to work as it does, as a proposed?
Yeah, it seems to me that the whole Overton window has shifted idea applies here. What's become politically correct to say in the media, in politics, in financial newsletters, and so on and so forth, has radically changed, even just over the last year or two. I would say the first to move was the government in the UK, the previous government in the UK, which suddenly started rolling back a lot of its net zero policies. But since then, we've seen countless companies, countless governments, all sorts of organizations abandoning their net zero commitments, abandoning the net zero projects. Lots of doubt, including from environmentalists, about offset projects. So the realization is dawning, and it seems like this common knowledge problem is what it's referred to. So there was an article by Ben Hunt from the Epsilon Theory during or just after the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And his argument was that we've all known all along that Joe Biden's too senile to become president. But the actual reckoning doesn't occur until we know that everyone else knows as well. Then it becomes a common knowledge. And I think we're starting to hit that point in the net zero energy transition as well. We've all sort of had our doubts about this all along. It was just considered to be politically correct to stick with it regardless. It's almost like a tug of war instead of trying to recognize the truth. But now that's changed. We've got to this point where even Bloomberg, even the mainstream media, even the mainstream politicians are admitting that the level of sacrifice needed to try and reach net zero is so high that it's unlikely to sustain support in a democracy. And that's what we've seen in elections in Germany recently, and I think we'll continue to see that right across Europe, especially. We might see it in the US very soon. The point being that radical change comes at the point when everyone knows that everyone else knows that this isn't going to work. The question is how the change occurs, right? Because I think it would be quite difficult for politicians to stand up and say, sorry, the world's not actually under threat from climate change. This was all just a big mistake. We can go back to burning coal. They're a lot more likely to say, well, we can delay net zero by another 20 years or whatever it might be. The earth won't burn and the oceans won't boil after it all. So my mining thesis would still continue to play out. It is, I suppose, possible that politicians will stand up and say, we don't need to worry about climate change. We need to worry about some other new threat. Who knows what it is? Maybe it'll be a pandemic. But the point being that if that occurs, I think the demand for commodities from an economy that can recover by not needing to go through net zero would still be quite good for the mining industry. So it's not, we should never say it's a win-win because it never is. Who knows what might happen? There might be a financial crisis which completely crushes commodity prices in the meantime. But I think the longer term outlook for mining and resources is extremely good, even if we decide to continue pursuing net zero. And that makes it a really good investment to have in your portfolio if you're worried about governments continuing to pursue that impossible goal.
Where do you think people started to realize that net zero is going to affect them detrimentally without the government actually having to tell them upfront that you've got to make these massive sacrifices, and they just realize, oh no, I didn't sign up for this?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think a big part of it was the awakening about the World Economic Forum, about the whole Davos story. You won't own anything and you'll be happy. I think that was one of the first dominoes to really go. Perhaps it was the Gilets jaunes movement in France, which subsequently spread around the world with the farmers, made everyone realize that, hold on a second, net zero really does require these quite severe sacrifices in the farming sector and so on and so forth. The truck drivers in Canada. So it might be that. My worry is that a lot of the reckoning has been masked by the pandemic and the response to the pandemic over the last few years. It's easy for people to blame what happened during that debacle, rather than acknowledge that actually a lot of these issues started well before the pandemic, and the energy crisis issues started before then, before Putin invaded Ukraine. So maybe it's going to take a few more years of problems directly connected to the net zero agenda to make people realize. For the moment, I see a lot of people who still believe in net zero saying things like, well, it's gas that failed because it didn't back up renewables. And you're trying to shut down gas. So the delusion is still sustaining itself to some extent. But the Overton window that's moved now includes mainstream people saying this isn't going to work unless you make enormous, terrible sacrifices. There was a report by a group of universities in the UK called the FIRES Group, FIRES, an acronym, I can't remember what it stands for. And they calculated what net zero would require if we don't have a decent offset technology. So if we really need to cut everything's emissions to zero rather than having some emissions that are then offset by carbon capture and storage. And their conclusions were absolutely horrifying. We can't ship anything anywhere, we can't fly. So it's absolutely terrifying. And I think these sorts of warnings made it credible to start calling out governments and politicians for announcing targets that they're legal targets in some cases that we don't actually have any hope of actually achieving. And so there's got to be a reckoning there. Perhaps we're so used to politicians doing backflips and denying that they previously said something, denying that they created targets, that this about face won't even be that noticeable. Perhaps I'm too honest when I say I can't imagine how a politician can possibly pull off suddenly claiming that the world won't end if we don't reach net zero by 2050, but that's just me.
So in Australia, the gas and electricity bills have gone up probably 30-40% in the last 2 to 3 years. I might be understating it even. What's it like over in Japan where you live? I know that you've only moved there recently, but talking to your relatives there, has the utilities bills gone up significantly in Japan in the last 3 years, given they don't have as much natural resources like we do in Australia? And I believe they have to import gas and coal, if to my understanding.
Yeah, so you're dramatically overestimating my ability to speak Japanese and communicate with my in-laws here. I don't know about utility bills specifically. I know that inflation for the first time in a very, very long time has started to move in Japan. It's causing a lot of angst and a lot of anger. People are saying it's like back in the bubble years. They literally use the word bubble because prices are going up and income's not keeping track. There was an excellent article in Bloomberg a few weeks ago, Bloomberg again, about how Japan had basically bought up huge amounts of gas supply all around the world. They bought the companies that are producing, and they bought into the projects that are producing and sending and shipping all of this gas supply, a lot of it going to Japan, as you say. So from what I can tell, Japan has avoided a lot of the green energy obsession from around the world. So the energy prices are a bit more stable. And they've sort of hedged their bets by investing heavily in gas so that they sort of benefit from it themselves. In a way, it's the reverse of the Australian position, which is that we're going to we might have to import gas into Australia soon. And, you can imagine the high prices. So I think the Japanese have played a bad hand quite well if they get their nuclear up and running again soon, especially so, which I think will be happening. Hopefully this broadcast is being brought to you by some measure of nuclear power, actually. And that would be the obvious way to go. So they might actually evade the whole temporary excursion towards renewables and instead just go straight back to nuclear power as they should have done in Europe in the first place.
Well, Nick, thanks a lot for the detailed responses and your insights. For more information, check out Fat Hell Daily, daily.fathealth.com.au. Check out Nick's article, and please leave your email address, subscribe to us, and you'll get daily email updates from our editors on our different perspectives and comments on what's happening in the current world and our investment opportunities. As Nick also mentioned, James Cooper has a short list of resources stocks with projects worth taking over. This could be a great good opportunity for you to take advantage of the low in most of the commodities that are in the world. Apart from gold, I think most commodities have been trading down significantly. So this would be a great time to get in. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot, and God bless.